Just how healthy was Jesus? Consider Jesus a first century peasant village artisan. How do you picture him as he looked when he was living and working in Nazareth and the Galilee? Is he robust, strong, tall, handsome to Western standards? Does he have clean and healthy hair? And also, take a moment to imagine Mary, his mother. How does this village peasant woman look? Is she healthy? How do you see her hair? Her eyes? Is she beautiful to Western standards? Does she smell like roses? Imagine if the historical Jesus and Mary smiled at you. What would their teeth look like? All pretty and white and clean? In good order? What if Jesus was speaking to you? In the Middle East, the average distance is much closer than in Western society, 6 to 8 inches. Would his breath smell? Take a moment also to consider how often Jesus in the Gospel heals those peasants like himself mostly, who were sick. There were so many sick that Jesus touched and interacted with. Sadly, our imaginations of many historical situations have been tainted and distorted. Dr. Richard Rohrbaugh explains that the 19th century has romanticized the peasant way of life and handed these romanticizations down to us. We get imprinted by Sunday school art and pictures from storybooks presenting a fantasy about what life was like for ancient peasants like Jesus and Mary. Scholars like Rohrbaugh inform us that in the first century Galilee, Jesus' time and place, birth rates were approximately 40 per thousand per year, twice that in the United States presently, although death rates were even higher still. This means that in our modern world we have the curious phenomenon of far fewer births and a rapidly rising population. In many peasant societies today, infant mortality rates have been estimated at 30%, and that amount was probably the same for first century Syro-Palestine. 1/3 of all children died before reaching 6 years old. Your 16th birthday, if you were an ancient village peasant, was bittersweet, because if you made it to that age, 60% of your fellow villagers were dead. At 26 years old, 75% were in the graves. By age 45, 90% of the total population was gone. If you could make it to 60 years old, you would have hit the lottery, because only 3% of the total population got to be that old. Given these facts, was a 30-something Jesus a young man or an old man when he died? Consider, 80% of his audience would have been younger than he was. And most of these people were looking forward to about 10 years of life remaining. The average age of death for male peasants like Jesus in the first century was 27. The average age of death for female peasants like his mother Mary was only 18. Rohrbaugh and other scholars tell us that disease and death rates fell disproportionately upon the lower classes of both city and village. Being a village artisan put Jesus and Mary among those lower classes. But Jesus and Mary did indeed make it to adulthood. Question: how would their health have been? Answer: atrocious. At 30 years old, the majority of peasants like Jesus suffered from internal parasites, tooth decay, and bad eyesight. Most of these peasants, since childhood, lived and struggled with the debilitating results of protein deficiency. And there were parasites everywhere, carried by sheep, goats, and wild dogs. 1/2 of all the hair combs found at Qumran, Masada, and Murabat were infected with lice and lice eggs. This probably reflected conditions elsewhere, like in villages such as Nazareth and cities such as Capernaum. In archaeological digs throughout the Holy Land, lots of bone fragments get discovered. Paleobiologists look at these remains, and they can tell what killed a person and how old they were when they died. As far as dental health goes, we have never uncovered from 1st century Palestine a skull with a complete set of teeth. So maybe, just maybe, we should drop those sentimental images of smiling Jesus? Huh? Malnutrition was a constant problem in Galilean villagers. We know this because of the high infant mortality rates, the age structure of the population, and pathological evidence from abundant skeletal remains. As much as 1/4 of a male Palestinian peasant's caloric intake came from alcohol. Half of all calories came from bread. Infectious disease was the most serious threat to life for ancients, the #1 killer for people in biblical times and a long time after. Ancient people had no way to control infection and its spread. Undoubtedly, infectious disease accounted for much of the high mortality rate among peasant children. Few peasants could afford professional physicians, and so most frequented shamanic folk healers of various kinds, one of whom was Jesus. And in Jesus' agonistic society, violence was rife everywhere. Douglas Oakman has shown in his study of the Gospel called Luke, in Galilean villages, violence was a regular and routine experience. Fraud, robbery, forced imprisonment or forced labor, beatings, inheritance disputes, and forcible removal of rents are all reflected in the village life of the Jesus story, as found in the Gospels. 15 reports or stories about such violent incidents are to be found in the Gospel called Mark alone. Who were the most common victims of violence? They were widows, aged parents without children, or parents of children with disabilities, the very young, the very old, those with diseases, deformities, or disabilities, and those whose land had been taken away from them by greedy elites. Peasant villagers constantly were suspicious of outsiders, feared and distrusted officials, especially those officials who could read and write, and hated anyone who threatened their subsistence. Folks, what does this all add up to? Think about it. Poor housing, non-existent sanitation, constant violence, economically inaccessible medical care, and horrendous dietary habits. What does this all do to devotionally romanticizing Jesus into a tall, attractive to Western standards, robust and healthy male? And when people claim to scientifically prove from unproven relics, such as the Shroud of Turin, that Jesus was healthy and robust, isn't this a rather insidious case of identity theft? Question: can we love somebody who we refuse to get to know? Jesus, help us to see you and those from whom you came. Amen.